So I'm going to be talking about my reflection on wooden hand mirror. So it's a historical Melanesian object, which this kind of paper came from a project that I undertook during my MA, where we were given objects without any contextual information and told to go and try to understand the object as best we could. This object is going to be a bit different from the other ones in the session. Oh, sorry, I accidentally did that. Different from the others so far, because it's not strictly ethnography, but it is influenced by ethnographic theories and kind of adds into the theories that Eric and Erica talked about at the beginning of the session to step out of our own ontology. So the aims in this presentation are to talk a little bit about the ethnographic studies used to understand this object and the method of object biography that I use to unfold the drama of the object. And this should give a greater nuance to the history and anthropology of the Trobriand Islands in the historic period. So I used object biography to contextualize the object and understand the references that are made in the construction of it, because it's essentially a collusion of Melanesian, specifically Trobriand beliefs, and a response to European encounter expressed within the object. So it's kind of a mimetic exploration of a European object, hand mirror, with allusions to traditional culture to challenge colonial power and ultimately anthropological assumptions as well. So the object biography approach, this is one of my early photographs of like trying to work out this object and understand it. So I'm going to use the biography approach to understand the peak life of the object as a kind of inscribed object being important in just its very creation to allow for a narrative of social action. The material, the shaping, the decoration, all aspects of this object are important in understanding it. As it was so devoid of contextual information to start with, I kind of had to pick apart each little bit of it. So here's a drawing that I did of the object and working it out. So it's made of two main sort of parts. There's a handle and then a face or kind of plate. Both faces are slightly lopsided, but you can tell that there's definite effort towards symmetry made, and there's decorations on the edges of both sides of the faces. And the plate itself is thicker in the top and bottom where it meets the handle, and then kind of tapers at the edges. So a little bit more understanding of it, it's both sides. On one side, the pattern is a series of interlocking spirals, and the other side is unbroken line of zigzags. And it's made of very dark, hard, but maneuverable at the same time. So the material it's actually made out of is Merbau wood. So in trying to understand the object, the first thing that I found about it was the kind of wood that it was made of from this big encyclopedia of all. It's a handsome, dark, heavy mahogany redwood, and it's native to the Trobriand Islands. So I understood the object came specific location. It was important in investigate high quality objects of spiritual importance. So kava bowls, canoe prows, that's the kind of thing this wooden material is used for. And the trees themselves are protected and cultivated in graveyards and sacred groves and around temples. So I would say that this type of wood for this object was chosen for its deliberate association with ancestry and with spirituality. So just to understand where the Trobriand Islands are in the world, just a quick map so we can understand where I'm talking about. And the ethnographic studies that I use to understand the object, because it is copying a European object, I related it to cargo cults, which is a traditionally sort of Melanesian social movement during the colonial era, where cargo is kind of desired or renewed and invented through ritual action, so performances. And generally, ethnographers talked about cargo as a concept that is kind of related to goods or money, but also more recently and in general, it's sort of described as a kind of desire for existential respect, and what I'm arguing, a kind of anti-colonial desire for political autonomy. So within these movements, there's a marked movement away from tradition, but ancestors are also extremely important. So we have a kind of juxtaposition of like rejecting tradition, but also alluding to it at the same time. And in this, Melanesians generally destroyed a lot of traditional objects, but then would create new objects that nonetheless referenced old traditions and the new ones that they are making. So this hand mirror, kind of wooden hand mirror, is mimetic of European objects. So it's related to cargo cults and anthropology. So in the process of making this object, it was cut from the heartwood of a hardwood tree, following along the grain. It's a single piece of wood, and the grain is kind of visibly noticeable throughout the object. And hardwood is very difficult to work, but with care, it can create really beautiful things with a lovely finish, which I think my object is very pretty. So it's probably made by a very knowledgeable carver, someone that made things akin to canoe prows, which are constructed of the same material. So here's in this picture, we have a guy carving a canoe prow, and Alfred Gell kind of describes the creation of the patterns found on canoe prows as a kind of psychological warfare, where through the creative process of making canoe prows, there's a kind of magic in the artistry. So through controlled knowledge to the craft, controlled access to the knowledge, there's a kind of disarming capacity to overwhelm, or maybe it's not comprehensible. So a lack of knowledge of this technical process creates this magic. So just to go into what some of the crafts that this object references, I'm going to talk about the European hand mirror, lapita and the sea, bill and bags, and ceremonial clubs. So to start with, the eponymous object, I think that my object mostly refers to a European hand mirror. I think it's skeuomorphic of 20th century hand mirrors. And this fits nicely into the list of European manufactured objects that tend to be part of the formation of cargo cults. So it kind of alludes to hand mirror shape and style, but it's not an exact imitation. It's got a slight amount of asymmetry. So it's actually more important that there's access to just the symbolism of the object, just referring to it in the ownership of a hand mirror for Trobriand Islanders. So the emphasis is placed more on visual aspects of the grain of the wood and the material that are more important in traditional aspects, rather than a specific reference to only a European hand mirror. So additionally, in terms of traditional craft, the thing that this object is most similar to is a ceremonial club. It shares a lot of attributes that are similar to it. They're often made of heavy hardwoods. Their attempts at nearly complete, perfect kind of symmetry, their size, their handleable nature, and their capacity for display. Because ceremonial clubs weren't just weapons, they tended to be display objects used in performances like dance gatherings and festivities like that. So I have an example here that I found when I was first doing my research, which has very similar zigzags to my object, just like a lot of Melanesian objects do. So it's a ceremonial spatulate club. And it's very similar in its patterns, in its hardwood, in the oiled finish, which is probably coconut oil like my object, and its handleable nature. So it kind of further suggests that this is an object from the Trobriand Islands. But ceremonial clubs vary a lot in size and shape, but no shapes are exactly the same as my object that I'm looking at. So it's another example made with the same wood. So to talk about the sea and references made to lapita and zoomorphism, I have a nice picture of a turtle, because hopefully this will make sense in this slide. So in this object, we have a lot of references to lapita motifs. So in the Western Pacific, there's a lot of reference to lapita style as a long-term kind of material culture form. And these within the lapita culture, not exclusively, but a lot, ideas of the sea and sea turtles come through quite frequently. but often in abstracted ways. So on this third picture, the triangles at the end that meet the handle kind of look a bit like a sea turtle's head. If you take the larger circular part as the shell, you can see the central part is thicker and tapers to the edges, much like the sea turtle's shell. And then this one's maybe a bit of a reach, but the final sawn off piece at the end, which looks quite zoomorphic seen from above. So I would say that the depth of time that the Lapita culture has had influence in the region in Melanesia and the Trobriand Islands and Oceania in general, it serves as a unifying tradition to refer to in opposition to colonial enterprise. So another craft that this object alludes to, the final kind of reference that I think it makes, is a reference to billum bags. So these are made of a variety of tree fibers and are known to have influenced other traditional crafts. And they have, what's interesting about them is that they are all made of a sort of single string, and they're in a continuous and unbroken geometry. And that's a lot like the faces on my object, where the geometry is never broken throughout the object. And in general, billum bags are manufactured as a female craft. They are understood in concepts of continuous fertility and motherhood, but they're also used for political and protection purposes. But when they're used by men, they go through transitions of signification where they're bound onto hard or flat surfaces. So I don't think it's too much of a conceptual leap to think that billum patterns could have been bound onto this hardwood object of the hand mirror. So billums are made using figure-of-8 loops that form from this continuous string that I think are very similar to the swirl patterns found on one side of the object, which I couldn't find in any really other objects from the Trobriand Islands when I was doing this research. The zigzag motif is very common, but not the interlocking spirals. So the use of this object. In this object, you kind of find an expression of power being immanent and accessible in all things through performance and physical participation with the object. So as part of a cargo cult object, it was used in performances, but in a similar way to ceremonial clubs. But this use was hybridized, so it moved away from tradition while also retaining the creative power and referencing traditional methods of accessing this power. So the act of actually making this object, I would say, is more important than its use in performances, just in its own assertion of new identities and cultural ways of understanding. Because I think you can understand it in a way to the master carver creating canoe prows, where you are trying to create these European goods or knowledge of European goods, and then that knowledge is sort of harnessed to create a kind of dazzling power, a disarming power, and you make the intangible manifest in this. So it allows access to knowledge and power in the creation of European things. So just a brief discussion before I conclude to talk about mimesis and concepts of the other. So most of the allusions made in this object are grounded in Trobriand Island society, billum bags, lapita, the ceremonial clubs, but with the blank faces of the object and its particular shape and the decorations being on either side, it's very reminiscent of a European hand mirror. So for Trobriand Islanders, the loss of and death of people translates into political action. So in a time of upheaval, we see this creation of a new form in this object. So we see the imitation drawing on the character and power of the original to create a passage into a new society, however fleetingly felt that is. So to conclude, some reflections on my hand mirror. Within anthropological accounts of cargo cults, there are very few mentions of objects and explorations of objects themselves. But despite this, because there's so many objects that are like this, and the power that objects like this have, anthropologists are forced to engage with indigenous understandings of material culture and distorting concepts of Western culture due to the influx that new forms with colonialism and globalization brought in to the islands. So without a reflective surface, it forces us to reflect. It recalls the power of a mirror in us to critique ourselves and the study of different ethnographic groups, and cargo cults in general. So this object didn't stay in the Trobriand Islands. It may have been discarded, taken, or sold, picked up by an ethnographer. And as Taussig, who writes a lot about mimesis, says, no understanding of mimesis is worthwhile if it lacks the mobility to traverse this two-way street. And this object crosses back and forth in time and space between cultures and politics entangled. Thank you very much.